Morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you are joining us from around the world. Welcome to our Forward Thinkers webinar series organized by the World Future Council. My name is Alexandra. I'm Executive Director at the World Future Council, and I'm delighted to moderate this webinar on the topic of preventing pandemics, living in harmony with nature. We're organizing this webinar on the occasion of the International Day on Biodiversity, which will be celebrated this upcoming Saturday, the 22nd of May. And the UN has proclaimed the UN Day to increase understanding and awareness on biodiversity issues. This webinar is actually live streamed on Facebook. In the International Year on Biodiversity, the World Future Council celebrated the Future Policy Award on the topic of biodiversity in partnership with the Convention on Biodiversity. And the award celebrates policies that are benefiting current and future generations. It's the first award at the international level that is focusing on impactful policies. And the aim of the award is to raise global awareness for exemplary policies in order to speed up policy action. The World Future Council is convening this webinar and also the award, and we envision a healthy and sustainable planet with just and peaceful societies now and for the future. And we do want to achieve this by identifying, evaluating, and also awarding and spreading exemplary policies. The COVID pandemic is killing people and also destroying economies. We have highlighted in past webinars that this is specifically actually negatively impacting also children and youth. And today with this webinar on the occasion of the International Day on Biodiversity, we want to focus on how biodiversity and also the preservation of ecosystems can help to prevent pandemics. Which exemplary policies exist, which measure governments should adopt nationally as well as internationally. So in the next 1.5 hours, I'm very delighted that we have a fantastic panel. You will be first hearing from Mrs. Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biodiversity. She will give a brief video address outlining why biodiversity is important and also which policy measures should be adopted by governments at the upcoming UN conference of the parties, which will be held in Kunming, China in October. This will then be followed by a presentation by Mrs. Julia Martin-Lefebvre. She's member of the Bureau of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. She's a counselor with the World Future Council and former Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We are then very happy to actually take a little journey to Costa Rica. We will have a brief video about Costa Rica's positive impact on nature. And we are very honored to have with us His Excellency, the Honorable Minister of Environment and Energy from Costa Rica, Mrs. Andrea Meza Murillo. This will then be followed by a presentation by Professor Dr. Jorge Cabrera. He's actually lead counsel at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and he actually is author of the Biodiversity Handbook on exemplary biodiversity policies. And last but not least, we take a little journey to Kenya to our youth representative. Patricia Mambua Kombo is founder of Paytree Initiative and UNCCD Land Hero. So all participants, very welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining. And you're also invited to ask questions in the chat. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, of course. So thank you all distinguished panelists for accepting our invitation, making time to speak with us today. We will now hear from the Executive Secretary of the CBD.
Dear colleagues, let me thank you all for the opportunity to address you briefly today on the occasion of your conference and to also mark the celebrations of the International Day for Biodiversity, which will be celebrated under the theme of where we are part of the solution. Your discussions represent an effort to reach for solutions that can be acted on by us all. As your seminar points out, COVID-19 crisis through which we are all living has served us as a wake-up call to fix our deteriorating relationship with nature. It has reaffirmed what we already knew, that biodiversity is fundamental for human well-being and critical for sustainable development. Biodiversity decline and the risk of future pandemics has many root causes: forest degradation and habitat fragmentation that drive human and wildlife increasingly into contact. More effective biodiversity policies can reduce the risk of future pandemics, potentially with a fraction of the economic and social costs associated with the global pandemic. The benefit and cost effectiveness of working with nature extend to other domains: food and water security, climate change, and others. People are starting to better understand the importance of biodiversity for their own health, well-being, and prosperity. Governments have come to recognize that recovery policies to recover from the COVID crisis need to focus on well-being and inclusiveness and trigger investments and behavior changes to reduce future shocks and build societal resilience. Building back better means protecting biodiversity to set on a path to sustainability. To achieve this, bold and interdependent actions are needed across several fronts, each of which is necessary and none is sufficient on its own. We must increase efforts to conserve and restore biodiversity, address climate change in ways that limit global temperature rise without imposing unintended additional pressures on biodiversity, and transform the way we produce, the way we consume and trade goods and services, and most particularly, food that rely on and have an impact on biodiversity. We must also look at how our systems of subsidies makes it profitable to be unsustainable. We need to work with nature as the solution to many of our sustainable development solutions. But how do we achieve this? The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, currently being negotiated by parties and set to be adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity later this year in Kunming, China, will take the world towards achievement of the UN 2050 vision, all for biodiversity living in harmony with nature. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework proposes a measure to prevent the loss of protected areas for nature and increase them substantially in the long term to ensure ecosystem resilience. By protecting nature and preventing people from coming into conflict with untouched parts of the wild, we can decrease the likelihood of future pandemics. The framework also includes proposals to guarantee and sustainably increase nature's benefits to people in order to improve global nutrition and access to drinking water, as well as to develop resilience to natural disasters and support efforts to achieve the Paris Agreement. All these goals are integral to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and can play a significant role in building resilience that the last year's IPBES report identified as needed. Crucially, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know what worked and what didn't work with the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020. Applying lessons learned from the implementation of the strategic plan will help us ensure an ambitious and transformative framework. This includes many elements. They need greater effort to address direct and indirect diversity loss, more effective and transparent monitoring and adequate resources, reduce time lag in planning and implementation of biodiversity strategies and action plan, and an integrated whole of government, whole of society approach to manage the natural environment and interaction with human society. Strengthen the integration of gender, the role of indigenous peoples and local communities, business, financial sector, and all other stakeholder engagement. And given the present pandemic crisis, we need to take One Health approach, which calls for managing ecosystems, including agriculture and urban ecosystems, as well as use of wildlife through an integrated approach to promote healthy ecosystems and healthy people. The recently published Global Biodiversity Outlook highlighted 3 key lessons learned that will help us inform the actions we need to take now. We learned that we need to ensure that actions achieved at national level have the scope of global targets. We also learned that greater efforts are needed to bring biodiversity into the center of decision-making in all aspects of life, government, and our economies. And finally, we need to work with nature to address the multiple challenges we face, achieving sustainable development, slowing climate change, and reversing biodiversity loss. Taking these lessons into account, world leaders are embarking on a journey to negotiate an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will be agreed later this year at the 15th Conference of the Parties in Kunming, China. It is imperative that we get a compact that will support and enable transformative change and alter the behavior of people, businesses, and governments around the world. Even as governments discuss the way to build a future life in harmony with nature, we must all immediately endeavor to protect ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity so crucial to human well-being and that of our planet. By acting for nature, we can create a fairer, healthier, and more sustainable world. So, in closing, I pose the question that defines our actions. Are you part of the solution to save biodiversity? If not as yet, then I invite you, become part of the solution for nature. Thank you for your time, and let me wish you a happy International Biodiversity Day. Thank you again.
So thank you very much, Mrs. Mlima, for the opening statement for our webinar and for your motivating call to action, which showed very clearly that we need to build back better. We really need healthy ecosystems and healthy people and healthy ecosystems. And we need to live in harmony with nature. You also referred to recommendations by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and therefore I'm very pleased to have with us now Mrs. Julia Marton-Lefebvre, who actually serves on the board of IPBES. So we are very happy to hear from you, Julia. Why is biodiversity so important, and what are your recommendations? Which actions governments need to take this year? Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your very inspiring statements. And this is great that we're having this meeting just now, this super year for biodiversity. So you asked me to speak about the significant role of biodiversity and then on the recommendations of IPBES on how to strengthen biodiversity. So first of all, on the important role of biodiversity, or let's just communicate this simpler and call it nature. This has been known for some time, although it is perhaps only now during this, what we call the super year for biodiversity, that we're beginning to appreciate the essential life support that we get from nature and that we have taken for granted for so long. We have thought that the Earth system will be able to take care of us forever. I doubt that any of you can give examples of any parts of your lives that do not depend on nature. The food we eat, fuel, wood, timber, many of our medicines, the purification of air and water, the decomposition of waste, mitigation and adaptation to climate change. These are issues that are really linked. The regeneration of soil, and just as importantly, our spiritual well-being. I mean, can you imagine a world without a forests or clean water, for example? So these all that I have just listed, and the list can be much longer, as you know, these have all been called ecosystem services. I have to say, I quite like the more positive tone of the term nature-based solutions. Nature does have solutions for all of these if we take care of it. So we have had a lot of warning about the state of nature and to find solutions, and the governments finally adopted the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1993, a year after the Rio Conference. And of course, as you know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of governmental and non-governmental organizations with the right mission about nature. So in 2012, IBBES was established to bring scientists closer to policymakers. And I remind you that IBBES is a similar mechanism to the IPCC, which of course was established much earlier in 1988. So IBBES published its first global and comprehensive assessment in 2019. And as we could expect, the analysis of the situation is dire. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. And the rate of species decline is accelerating, so that today, 1 million species are threatened with extinction. At the launch of this important assessment, the first on biodiversity, we've had several on climate, the then chair of IBBES, Sir Robert Watson, said, and I quote, "The health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundation of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide." This is a problem that's shared. In 2020, we came to the end of a 10-year period that Elizabeth talked about without having met the ambitious goals adopted enthusiastically by governments in 2010 in Japan. I was at that enthusiastic meeting. The situation is so urgent now that new goals to be set this year, again, which is called now, well, it was supposed to be last year, it was called the Super Year for Biodiversity, simply cannot fail. Work is ongoing to agree on this so-called post-2020 biodiversity framework, which Elizabeth mentioned, which I hope also will be adopted in October, and which absolutely must deliver results to allow nature's ability to provide all those services. So the work preparing this super year, of course, has had to slow down because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a way perhaps for nature to remind us that it can give us its protection only if we all behave more wisely and than we have up to now. So in 2020, the government members of IBBES asked for a study on the link between biodiversity loss and the pandemic. This study, which is on the IBBES website, and it's very well written, it concluded that pandemics have their origins in diverse microbes carried by animals, but their emergence is entirely driven by human activities. The responsibility is with us. The underlying causes of pandemics are the same global environmental changes that drive biodiversity loss and climate change. These bring wildlife, livestock, and people in closer contact, allowing animal microbes to move into people and lead to infections, sometimes outbreaks, and more rarely into true pandemics, which is what we see now, that spread through road networks, urban centers, and global travel and trade routes. The recent exponential rise in consumption and trade, as well as by demographic pressures, has led to a series of emerging diseases. The report does not tell us that this is the only one. This is a big one and a bad one, but there will be others unless we change our ways. So of course, the reasons for all this are the unsustainable exploitation of the environment due to land use changes, agriculture expansion, wildlife trade, and frankly, our inability to take rapid action in spite of the many warnings and the many, many recommendations. So perhaps we've had to have this dramatic reminder that we're close to a tipping point and that strong action has to be taken to avoid a catastrophe from which we cannot turn back. Now, there are solutions, of course, and I really love the message that Elizabeth told us. We are a part of the solution. This is a responsibility. So what is needed is effective and seriously enforceable global cooperation to put these solutions into practice. There is a proposal, the 30 by 30 proposal by governments, which may or may not be a part of the post-2020 framework, but the idea is to protect 30% of land and 30% of the oceans by 2030. And this would be a really important tool, in my view, to get us away from the precipice. So I think we need to work hard to communicate solutions that we know work, so that understanding the seriousness of the challenges and the need for positive and global action, we don't just stop with setting goals, but move rapidly to following up these goals with effective action. And this is something we haven't done all that well. We're pretty good at setting goals. So we already have ample examples of conservation that can slow extinction rates. Remember what the IBES assessment said, 1 million species will be extinct. So for example, just to give some concrete examples, since 1993, at least 28 bird and mammal species would have been lost without intervention, benefiting from enforceable legal frameworks, from invasive species control, conservation, and research in zoos and collections, followed, if possible, by reintroductions, and the effective protection of terrestrial and marine areas. We have many other examples of such conservation successes. So there is no question in my mind that if we agree to protect 30 by 30 by 2030, which is more or less tomorrow, we need to do so really carefully and effectively. The goal is much more ambitious than the 2010 attempt to arrive at protecting 17% of terrestrial and 10% of marine areas, which we have not managed to meet. The global conservation community has conducted numerous assessments of the best way to manage protected areas, and these management tools will need to be adhered to if we're really serious about this ambitious goal of 30 by 30. So these are just some examples. I just want to just close reminding you that during this year, there was also a very important other report, the so-called Dasgupta Review of the Economics of Biodiversity, released earlier this year. And this is like the Stern-like look at biodiversity. And the first lines of the report tells us that we are totally dependent upon the natural world. It supplies us with everything we need and so on. I really advise you to read this report. It's very, very important. And the important thing at the very end is that the report says that we really need to rethink our economic system so that we actually appreciate the role and value the role of nature in our well-being. Thank you very much. I look forward to a good discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Julia, for highlighting again very clearly the alarming situation for this wake-up call, and also for highlighting again this very important report with very clear recommendations. As you have mentioned, we could face other pandemics if we don't change, but we are part of the solutions. And we have a unique opportunity this year in the super year for biodiversity and nature. There is also hope. We have also positive examples around the world around these nature-based solutions. And now we're going to take a little trip actually to Costa Rica, to this country which is known for really prioritizing to make peace with nature. And we now will start with a little film so you get a little insight about Costa Rica.
A mí me gustaría lograr que en el año 2050, aunque parezca muy lejano, yo le pueda responder a mi hijo, que hoy tiene 6 años, en este momento hicimos lo correcto, hicimos lo que había que hacer para que él pudiera ver un mundo mejor, principalmente frente a los efectos del cambio climático. La acción tiene que ocurrir ya. Yo soy Carlos Alvarado Quesada, presidente de la República de Costa Rica. Costa Rica tiene una larga data de logros, pasan por lo ambiental, pero también en otros campos. Es una parte de tradición, de innovación y de desarrollo humano. Costa Rica eliminó el ejército para ser un país de paz hace 70 años. Hace 50 años, gente visionaria también decidió llevar adelante un modelo de desarrollo basado en parques nacionales y en áreas de conservación. Costa Rica hoy tiene más del 50% de su territorio con algún grado de protección y también logramos de la década del 80 ahora revertir la deforestación de un 20% que llegó y revertirla para ahora tener una cobertura forestal de más del 52%. Y ese es el legado de otra generación. Ahora yo cargo con una responsabilidad de tomar eso que recibí y también proyectarlo al futuro de la próxima generación. Alguien dirá, Costa Rica es un país muy pequeño, lo que haga no tiene un impacto en las emisiones globales, pero lo que se hace en Costa Rica demuestra que sí es posible. ¿Cómo es posible que un país de renta media tiene el 99.5% de su energía eléctrica limpia y renovable? Eso lo que demuestra es que sí se puede. Hay países con mucho mayor potencial que lo pueden hacer. Si nosotros logramos revertir la deforestación y crecer económicamente a través del ecoturismo y de otras formas ecológicamente ambientales de crecimiento, demuestra que tanto aquí como en otras partes sí se puede mantener los bosques y crecer económicamente. Es un honor que mi país reciba esto por lo que han hecho quienes han estado antes y quienes están ahora. Es una gran responsabilidad de ser consistentes con este legado y seguir adelante. Y no es haciendo lo mismo. Lo que esto significa es tenemos que hacer más.
So Costa Rica did not only receive the Champion of the Earth Award, it also received the Future Policy Award for its biodiversity policy, which we awarded together with the Convention on Biodiversity because of its remarkable achievements for biodiversity. And we actually celebrated the award already at the UN Conference of Parties in Nagoya. And we updated the policy, of course, at the World Future Council again last year. And we were impressed that Costa Rica continues on its path to be a leader globally on biodiversity conservation, and with very impressive results. So we know 25% of land is under protection. We have 20% reversal of forest deforestation, and we have almost 6% of the world's biodiversity in Costa Rica on biodiversity. So we are very honored to have with us today the Honorable Minister of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, Mrs. Andrea Meza Murillo. A very warm welcome to you. So let me ask you, Honorable Minister, could you please explain to us what were actually the key drivers that led to the development of such an effective biodiversity policy in Costa Rica?
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you to the World Future Council for convening this event. We are in the celebration of the International Biodiversity Day, and I think it's great to have these webinars, these roundtables, so we can be exchanging views, lessons learned, and I will say to continue generating momentum about the importance of nature and protecting nature as part of our development model. That is what I would like to remark and start by saying this. Why this has been
Yes.
Why this has been so important? I will say that that we have taken nature, and I like to take the word nature instead of biodiversity, because I think this is so important when we are talking about convening other stakeholders and trying to engage with different stakeholders. The word biodiversity is so technical, it's hard to really understand it, but when we talk about nature, then we connect our hearts, our brain, and I think it's easier then to communicate when we're talking about nature and nature-based solutions. And why it has been so important, it's because we're understanding that nature is part and it's a central piece of our development model. And this is so important. This is not an environmental issue. When we're talking about trying to stop the biodiversity loss, we really need to understand that we need whole of a government and whole of society approaches. And we have the policy, yes, but we understand that we need to mainstream this policy into our national development plan, that we need to generate coherence of our sectorial policies. And this is what I will say has been one of the key elements of the success of this policy. But the other element is to, and I think that Julia made the point, is to really understand the economic benefits that protecting nature generates, and to really understand nature as an asset of the country. And then this will facilitate the mobilization of public and private resources and will catalyze different economic activities. But I will say that it's so important that we understand that this is an asset, that we need to work with the different communities. And this is the other element, to really understand benefit sharing. And we really need then to work with the local and indigenous communities and to have this systemic approach. I will say that these are part of the critical elements of our policy, to understand that as a central element of our development model, not seeing this as an environmental issue, but as a development issue, then to mainstream this in the whole policy framework, to have this whole of society approach also as a critical component of all this work.
Excellent, thank you so much. Now, you obviously also achieved not only that nature is benefiting, but also actually is helping for climate adaptation. You have income generating activities. Could you just highlight again the positive benefits that you see in Costa Rica of the policies that you're promoting for nature and for biodiversity?
Yes, yes, Alexandra. I will say that just some facts that we have here. For example, a recent report evidenced that protected areas in national parks have provided financial benefits of almost $2 billion in 2018 alone. That represented around 3% of our GDP. But something that we will be releasing tomorrow actually is that we have been analyzing what's the value of this natural capital in Costa Rica. And the numbers are incredible. The numbers that they are giving me here right now is that our natural capital represents annually around $15 billion. And this represents almost 23% of our GDP. And this is just concrete numbers. And this is so important because these numbers allow us to have these conversations with the Minister of Planning, with the Minister of Finance, to really understand why it's so important to invest in nature, invest in the protection of nature. And this is why we have been looking for innovative mechanisms, such as the payment of environmental services, putting taxes on fossil fuels, and using that money to pay the local landowners for the service that they're giving when they are protecting the forest. And this is the kind of policies that we are implementing, that we are generating, and this connection and to understand the economic benefits, I think it is so critical, but it is also so critical to mobilize these resources to the local communities and to the landowners of the forest. I think that these are part of the critical elements that we have been addressing.
Well, congratulations to your numbers and impact. It's very impressive. I look forward to seeing the report that you will publish tomorrow. 23% of the GDP contribution by nature, really amazing. And I think it's very interesting for other countries to learn from you. So I would like to ask you, what do you think, what can other countries learn from you?
I will say that we're facing a lot of challenges as many countries. I mean, we are not different from other countries. This is a country that it is a middle income country, very small, and we're facing a very small fiscal space as well, and an economic crisis right now from this COVID pandemic. But we have learned that implementing good policies is critical and that will generate welfare. So it's about policy making. And this is a little bit when we saw the video, the actions that we are implementing right now, we will see the kind of model and the kind of development that our children and the future generations will be living and facing. And we have a legacy here that we need, and we need to be coherent with that legacy, because we have seen that investing in this net zero, nature positive model is good for our people. And we need to continue in this pathway. It's about long-term planning, but it is understanding that when we have these long-term policies, does not imply that we will not be taking actions now. No, we need to start taking actions now, and we will see the results and the milestones that we would like to achieve in the long term. So it's about this clarity and understanding that policy matters.
Yes, we need to start now in order to have a better future for our children and grandchildren. And I understand Costa Rica is also very active now proposing this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. You're also demanding a global deal for nature. So could you please just explain, what are you proposing concretely? What should governments adopt in October?
Thank you. This is the other element. As a small country, we strongly believe in multilateralism. And this is why we're promoting this 30 by 30 goal, because we need to hear science. And we have launched this high ambition coalition for nature and people, which is basically advocating that the post-2020 framework adopts this concrete milestone. And we know that we're talking about a lot of elements in this post-2020 framework, but the lesson learned, we think, from the Paris Agreement is that when you have some specific concrete milestones, then it's easier also to include them in the national policies and also to engage with other stakeholders. It is easier then to mobilize the different people, the different stakeholders, and also to understand how to mainstream these in the national policy. So for this reason, we're making a big momentum, a big group around the 30 by 30 goal. But we understand that we also need to address other elements, of course, that we're talking about, the quality of how to manage protected areas. What are we going to do in landscape management? These are all elements that we will be addressing, but we need to have a concrete number, as we did with the Paris Agreement with the 1.5 ambitious, then the 30 by 30 is the goal that we also want to be there in the hearts and the minds of the different stakeholders.
Thank you. I really hope many more countries will join you in supporting this call for 30% by 2030, and we will get a strong biodiversity framework in October. I now actually would like to thank you very much for the moment. I see already many questions coming in after the presentation by Julia and by you. But we now have an exciting presentation. I would like now to invite Professor Dr. Jorge Cabrera. He is the council lead at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and we have commissioned him to work on a handbook on exemplary biodiversity laws, which role they can play to prevent pandemics. So welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning, Alexandra. Good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be part of this great event with such a great participants. And yes, I would like to share with you some of my initial findings and conclusions on the research that we have done on the identification of how biodiversity loss can play a role in preventing or addressing pandemics. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I hope I can share the screen. Okay, I hope you can see it. It is now on my screen. Yes, and thank you to the World Future Council for this assignment to produce and to revise a prior study that we done in 2014 in order to identify exemplary biodiversity laws and policies and how these laws can be useful in order to prevent future pandemics. I'm a lead counsel of the CISDL, and also I am, of course, acting as a consultant for the handbook for the World Future Council. Well, just some background, some context. Of course, as you can see, there are many different approaches or many different instruments that can be put in place in order to address and prevent future pandemics. Some of them are, of course, of economic nature. Some of them are related to awareness raising or public education, social actions. But also there is, I think, and this is one of the conclusions of the study that I will be presenting later, that there is a strong role to be played by the law. In this case, and because the study is limited to biodiversity laws, and if these laws are fully implemented and based on the content that we identify, many of these legislation have, there is a strong role and a strong possibility for us to address and prevent future pandemics. So basically the purpose and the objective of the research was to update and expand the 2014 report on biodiversity laws and policies. But the idea now was to focus and to provide some emphasis on how the biodiversity laws and policies, the content and the implementation can be instrumental in order to address future pandemics, especially through ecosystem, wildlife management, sustainable use and conservation, incentives, institutional arrangements, etc. And also to revise and update the existing elements for a future GS biodiversity law. So the idea is to determine what are the critical areas or the principles or characteristics that a biodiversity law, a biodiversity policy can integrate in order to achieve, in order to be nominated as an exemplary biodiversity law. And we hope that all of these can contribute to the national, regional, and global processes of biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and something that I think it's quite important, and was mentioned by Andrea Mesa from the Ministry from Costa Rica, is the fair and equitable benefit sharing arising from the use of biodiversity more broadly. So first, I think what we clearly identified was that there is a lot of information about the environmental roots and causes behind as factors of the pandemic, especially the COVID-19, but of course others that can come in the future. And there are many different reports. IPES has produced a very specific one about the role of biodiversity and pandemics. CITES, the WHO, UNEP has also produced some particular or sectorial documents and reports addressing how biodiversity, how nature, and I like as well to use this word instead of biodiversity, can be a critical factor in order to prevent future pandemics and to address future pandemics as well. And this is also linked to this emergent concept of One Health. So, and the legal implications of the One Health concept, that is not only about the health of nature, it's about the health of people. And these two things are of course integrated and linked, absolutely linked. And the third issue, I think, is that these laws can also be useful in order to achieve what now we can conceptualize as nature-based solutions. Initially, this concept was more or less limited to climate change adaptation or mitigation, but now we are looking at nature-based solution as a concept that is more ambitious and that is trying to achieve and trying to address social, economic, and environmental problems and concerns, and to provide appropriate solutions, appropriate responses. So I think that the biodiversity laws can also be useful in order to promote these nature-based solutions. We also have, and I think this is important, of course, many different international instruments that we briefly address in the paper, such as, of course, the CBD, the CMS, CITES, the International Plant Protection Convention for Animal Health, the SDGs, the Lugano guidelines recently produced by the ILA Association on the duties, the responsibilities of the states in order to protect natural resources for development, nature. And also there is an interesting movement in terms of legal instruments at the international level, and this is part of the handbook, which is the idea put forward by the WHO to negotiate a pandemic prevention treaty under the WHO instruments. This is quite interesting, and of course, the focus of this particular treaty, as far as we know, with the available information, will be the health responses. But it could be interesting to see to what extent environmental components can be integrated in this treaty in order to prevent, in a more integral manner, the emergence of future pandemics. Unfortunately, other pieces of law that are not included, but anyway quite relevant, such as trade, agriculture, sanitary law, health law, IPR, which is now a critical issue in the fighting against COVID-19, and there are many discussions in the WTO TRIPS Council about the role of IPR also in addressing especially, but maybe also in preventing future pandemics. And there is a very recent report published by released by the WHO on the failures of the current system in order to address pandemics. But the focus of the document is basically national responses. So how national law, and in this case is limited to biodiversity law, can really play a role in preventing and in addressing the roots, the factors identified that are some of the causes of the emergence or the expansion of the pandemics. There are, of course, several key areas of law, such as the species level management, including trade, the treatment of exotic species, biosecurity more broadly, ecosystem protection, ecosystem restoration, including protected areas and other based area mechanisms, which are also quite relevant jointly with protected areas, incentives, payment for ecosystem services, environmental impact assessment, forests, land use, the general principles of the laws, the institutional arrangements, which in some cases creates an enabled platform in order to produce a biodiversity planning processes, which are also key for the implementation of and the achievement of the biodiversity objectives. So basically we update the content and the implementation status of these countries, and we added France, which has a very interesting biodiversity law, Dominican Republic, because it's an island. I think it's quite important also to have this perspective of a small developing country island. And Australia, which is a big, of course, country, but has a lot of environmental laws and a strong reputation for addressing and for looking for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And this is also a very interesting piece of legislation. Basically, what we did was to identify principles, objectives, institutional arrangements of each of these laws, and mechanism tools, including environmental impact assessment, protected areas, wildlife, in situ and ex situ, biosafety, biosecurity, which is broadly, I mean, it's not just GMOs, but it's also exotic species and the introduction of other species, participation incentives, traditional knowledge, which is quite important, and benefit sharing, research on biodiversity and data management, education and public awareness, the planning process, and the identification of biodiversity threats, as well as sanctions, monitoring and review and funding. And when feasible, we try also to present some data on the impacts of the laws, because this is not only very easy to do because the linkages between the law and the achievement of some concrete impacts or results is not necessarily very evident in most of the cases. But more important, what I think we identified was that after reading with the perspective of how these laws can prevent pandemics, the laws, I mean the prior laws plus the two new ones, we identified that there are a common set of elements or legal instruments. Not necessarily all of them are incorporated in every law that we identified, but these are more or less common elements, or at least are elements that can be identified arising from the different laws that can be very useful in order to prevent pandemics. I think one element is the principles and objectives. Many of the biodiversity laws are very, very explicit in terms of the environmental law principles, prevention, the precautionary principle, the recognition of the rights of nature, which is a concept under development right now, but in few laws, at least you can anticipate that this concept is maybe not explicitly included, but is implicitly included if you read some of the definitions, articles, principles of the law. The recognition of the intrinsic value of life, of nature, the integration principle, the polluter pays principle, among others. The second element found in some of these biodiversity laws is the ecosystem approach. The ecosystem approach is recognized as the approach to be taken in order to promote conservation of nature. There are also measures, sometimes very general, and to be complemented with other sectoral laws for in situ and ex situ conservation, including protected areas and other area-based mechanisms. Then there is also some component of wildlife and domesticated animal treatment, including bans, restrictions. This is not necessarily included with the same level of development in each of the laws, but in general, you can identify this as a common concept. Exotic species, biosecurity measures, more broadly, as I mentioned. In some cases, there are also measures to prevent deforestation, and this has been identified as one of the key causes or key factors that can promote the appearance of future pandemics, and to increase forest coverage and to prevent land use change, especially for agriculture. Incentive payment for ecosystem services also can be clearly identified as a part of many biodiversity laws that we studied. Not necessarily this is a very strong component in terms of implementation in many countries. National planning and mainstreaming of biodiversity in other sectors is something that is, I think, incorporated in almost all the biodiversity laws. And I think this is quite important. Of course, following some of the CBD decisions on mainstreaming biodiversity in other sectors including agriculture and others. Environmental impact assessment and other relevant tools. The protection of TK and the TK use in order to address pandemics and prevent pandemics is also a component of some of the biodiversity laws, like the one in India, Costa Rica, and a few others, which I think it's a critical element, an essential instrument in order to also avoid this appearance of new pandemics. Biodiversity research, this is also, I think, something extremely important. Biodiversity research, biodiversity data management, science and technology in terms of biodiversity. I think this component, which in some cases is not very strong, can play an extremely useful role in order to prevent future pandemics. And this is something that, especially developing countries, we need to put more attention and to put perhaps more efforts in order to implement these general provisions found in many of the biodiversity laws. And finally, there are institutional arrangements, funding, monitoring, review, sanctions, and penalties. It depends, of course, of each of the laws, but after the analysis of these 9, you can conclude that these are more or less elements that can be identified as a result of this collective research of laws, not necessarily because all of them are included with the same weight in each of the biodiversity law, but are key components of the biodiversity laws in general. And if you look at these components and if you think about how to prevent pandemics, I think one key conclusion is that is extremely relevant to prevent pandemics. I'm about to finish because I think I'm running out of time with some of the summary of findings. There is a diversity of content and status of implementation of these 9 laws. Some are very good in terms of implementation. In others, like Dominican Republic, especially the benefit sharing part, it's very, very well implemented. Others, not really. There are some common features and characteristics like principal instruments and mechanisms. There is a combination of specific and sometimes very vague mandates with very specific, and sometimes very general and vague mandates in order to conserve biodiversity. In some cases, there is a lack of appropriate implementation, especially incentive, technology transfer, research and data management, penalties. These laws, in general, I think, we don't have enough evidence, but have a very good role in inspiring other laws and in creating linkages with other relevant legislation. Fully implemented can play a strong role in preventing pandemics. In all the cases, needs to be complemented by sectoral environmental laws, forestry, protected areas, wildlife, general environmental laws. And of course, needs to be complemented by other laws that are not environmental. Food safety, animal health and welfare, food production, agriculture, trade, customs. But I think we have a lot of information and lessons learned that can inform the post-2020 biodiversity framework and eventually a future WHO treaty on pandemics. I'm gonna finalize here because I think I'm out of time.
Thank you very much, Professor Cabrera, for your excellent presentation. The World Future Council is very pleased to work with you and to work with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. We've been having a very many years of collaboration with you because we think it's very important to highlight these exemplary biodiversity laws. And it's very important now also to continue the work now that we have this super year for biodiversity. And we will be presenting the final handbook with you actually in the run-up of the Biodiversity COP in Kunming, China. We're also happy that we can present it at the World Health Summit, which will be held in October in Berlin, in Germany. There will be a World Health Summit held. So with that, we want to thank you very much, and also thank you very much again to the Minister who has taken the time to join us today. And with that, actually, we now are moving on and take a little journey to Kenya. And I want to introduce you now to our youth representative, Patricia Combo. She is a founder of Paytree Initiative, and she is also UNCCD Land Hero. And we will now see a brief video from her about her work in Kenya. So please enjoy.
Climate change is a human rights issue, and just like we protect human rights, and so should we protect climate change because of its impact it's having on people. We should not only protect our rights, but the rights of future generations. Today, the shade you're enjoying is because someone planted a tree long time ago. Be counted, grow your tree today. Take action today. Panda miti, boresha Kenya.
And here we have with us live, Patricia, welcome. I'm very glad to see you here. And now, let me just ask you, actually, could you tell us a little bit about your work at the PayTree Initiative? What are actions that you are taking to improve biodiversity?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. And I will answer that by showing you a presentation that I have made. Let's see this. For the sake of our viewers, my name is Patricia Kombo. I'm 24 years old and I'm the founder of PayTree Initiative. And PayTree Initiative is an idea that was born out of passion and also the need to incorporate young people in conservation and also educate them on how to adapt and mitigate effects of climate change. And this was after I visited Turkana Lodwar in 2019, and I saw the challenges that young children in the region were experiencing. So with PayTree Initiative, our work majorly is on conservation and also introducing nature to young kids. And we do so by tree growing. And the reason why we chose on tree growing is because at first, it is simplest form of conservation because it does not need any expertise, and it makes students to connect with nature easily. And this I'll take you through our work. Now on tree growing, what we do, because at first when I started, I was still in university and I did not have a lot of funds to fund for the initiative. So I used the locally available materials, and as you can see, we've been harvesting seeds, indigenous seeds from trees when it is dry. Then we sun-dry them, then we put them in nursery. And the reason is we want to show communities that they can restore, or rather they can conserve environment by using what they have at their disposal instead of having to incur a lot of expenses. The first photo is us in a tree planting event in a certain school. This one we are using the seed box. It's another way of growing trees whereby for the kids, they can use it when they are working, they can just grow. Then again, we are working on kitchen gardens. And first of all, we do not only just grow trees, we're majorly working on growing indigenous trees and fruit trees. And the reason why we do this is because we know the importance of growing the right tree at the right place, because you could grow a tree in the wrong place and instead of getting the benefits, it could actually be harmful to the nature and ecosystem. Secondly, we are working with farmers to practice agroforestry. One reason that we chose agroforestry because from where we come from, and Kenya's economy relies on agriculture and other natural resources. So a lot of farmers have been clearing trees and forests to expand their farms. So the notion was to educate farmers that they can, as well as do agroforestry, they can as well as grow trees and also make harvest from their farm by incorporating both. So we do research and we give farmers based on their region, the trees which will suit their farms. Then we are working with young people and school-going children in setting up community tree nurseries and training them how to use locally available materials. The reason why we chose young people is because I realized there's a disconnect. And no matter what we do, no matter the conferences, no matter the policies we put, if we fail to go back to young generation and help them grow, knowing the importance of nature, we will all be doing zero work. And one quote I usually tell people a child without environmental knowledge is like a bird without feather. They will never fly. And you know, it's the nature of birds to fly. So we need to work with kids at tender age by training them, walking them the journey so that they can appreciate first the importance of nature. Secondly, they can stand boldly to defend and also to advocate for their rights. And third, through training them, we are actually making them to be bold enough so as to ensure they gain the 21st century skills. Then we are farming organically by setting up kitchen gardens to utilize land and conserve water. One cause of land degradation is how people farm. You'll find people, they will just farm anyhow, and this will lead to soil erosion and also losing of soil nutrients, which are crucial for a healthy ecosystem. So we are farming organically, first of all, to put an end to use of like pesticides and other chemicals. These are some of our work. This was during a sensitization meeting on environmental conservation, and we had 5 schools from a certain region, whereby we had like introduction of environmental clubs. We had their teachers, and we were able to grow trees and also donated some seed balls. And the aim was for kids, it is always beautiful when kids interact with other children, like it's like peer learning, they're able to exchange. And we all know initially we've had the theory-based curriculum. So when kids have a chance to go to nature, to interact, actually it makes them to be happy. So this one was an event, and as you can see, we are all seated under a tree. So it was easy for us to tell them the importance of nature and the reason they should grow trees. And these are other events we've been working with kids in the community. And as you can see, this one is a bathtub. And the idea of bathtub came because in some region, land is limited and they want to spare that extra piece of land to do farming. So we came up with locally available materials. We use locally available materials so as to make like restoration of nature and protecting biodiversity to be as friendly as it can. In the first picture, we've used a broken basin, and we have over 100 trees. So we collect the seeds, we sun dry them, then we put them in a nursery. So this one acts as our nursery for the time being before now we transport to the place where we want to grow. And this one is it's eco-friendly because we realized a lot of people were burning their waste, and some of plastic were, they used to burn all of them without knowing the negative impact of the smoke. So we are actually solving a problem of waste going to landfills and also communities burning some of this, and actually telling them that they can find value in it. This again, it's at the bathtub, and this one we were demonstrating the community members how to do avocados. And one thing that we've been working is not the fruit trees. First of all, we want communities to feel proud and also to connect with nature by growing fruit trees, because first of all, they have generative income. When the fruits are ready, they can sell. Again, when the fruits are ready, they can actually act as supplement for food, and some fruits are good for, for nutrition. Again, divesting indigenous, these are agrivaria, some of the trees that we've been majorly working for agroforestry in Kenya, and also we've been using Melia volunteeki. This one we harvested during lockdown, and we've already put them in nursery and donated. And our tree nurseries are usually for donation. We do not sell the trees. We give them to communities and also to school people. In schools, we majorly grow fruit trees, and also we grow trees around the fence, just to ensure the fence is like a tree. Then, as you can see, this is one thing we did last year in April. I went.
Thank you, Patricia. Patricia, thank you so much. We now actually have a lot of questions coming in the Q&A. Yeah. And we still want to have some time to answer and have a discussion with our panel. So thank you so much for your inspirational presentation and your impressive work in Kenya. So let me now actually give the audience a chance. We've been collecting questions and we have questions. So let me just summarize now, and we can have first, I'm going to start with some questions to Julia actually. Julia, we have a series of questions to you, so I try to summarize them. First of all, there's a question about countries can help to curb future disease outbreaks by protecting nature. How can they curb future pandemics? Then there's a second question to you. Despite existing challenges in protecting biodiversity worldwide, what actually makes you hopeful about the future? And then there's a third question to you. Nature and biodiversity are in a worrisome state. What do countries need to do to tackle biodiversity loss? And finally, what role can business play in supporting the biodiversity conservation?
Well, okay, that's a lot of questions, but let me just say that for all of these questions, we need international collaboration that goes beyond beautiful statements, beautiful goals. Everybody goes home and gets on with their lives without following up. So in all of the questions, we need that. And we need then the legal frameworks to be attached. We have a goal, we're gonna do it. And if you don't do it, it's difficult, it's trouble for you. This is absolutely a universal human right to have nature be healthy for all of us. So, I mean, I am hopeful in the sense that I think we have now realized, and somebody after me who spoke, and well, biodiversity itself is just so difficult to communicate to the person on the street. So let's talk about nature. And I think now people are not shy to talk about that. It's important to have high-level scientific publications, use a complicated science language, but become bilingual also in being able to communicate to everyone, including decision makers. And so nature is something I think people do understand. They can't imagine life without nature. And now that there is a general understanding, frankly, as I said in my little statement, of course, nature didn't wake up one day and said, I'm going to show people how important it is to take care of me, nature, and therefore I'm going to let this pandemic go. But we could interpret it that this is a real call for action. If we survive and I mean everybody, I've been vaccinated, but that's not enough. People all over the world have to be vaccinated. If we can survive this and learn from this, and we have all of these meetings this year, which are going to make decisions, perhaps, and that's what makes me hopeful, but I think this is a last chance, really, that we need, perhaps because of this, the urgency and the pandemic's cause being linked to our incursions into nature. We're now, and so one of the solutions in the first question is and I try to say that over and over again, is certainly putting aside 30% of marine, 30% of terrestrial ecosystems and managing them well. It's not enough to say I've got 30% of my country protected. I'm managing it, I'm protecting it. Then, nature can take care of itself, take care of us, and we don't come together as often as we have been lately. So I am basically optimistic, and we've had to maybe come to this near tipping point to be able to say, now we really want to do it. The last question about business, the international system or the intergovernmental system that was designed 75 years ago, and it could use some changing. It puts governments at the decision-making, in the decision-making situations. But more and more governments are now calling upon business to advise them, to be a part of finding solutions before they go to China or somewhere else for their big conferences of the parties to make decisions. I feel very strongly that business has a really important role to play. There is no business that doesn't need nature for making money and for making, so it also needs to take care of nature. So I am not pessimistic, but I hope that we don't have a meeting a year from now, again celebrating the International Day of Biodiversity or of Nature. And I hope that I can still be optimistic, but this is the year when this has to happen. And it is a bit ironic that it was supposed to be in 2020 and we've had to stop because nature is reminding us we've gone too far.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much. Now let me turn it over to Professor Cabrera. I have some questions for him. There's a question about what are for you the main threats of biodiversity and which laws are necessary to stop them? This is the first question to you. The second question is, the need for new laws that protect biodiversity is beyond question, though what is needed to ensure that they are actually implemented? And then let me ask another question to you from Mr. Shyam. Despite such serious warning, we humans seem not to have learned a lesson and continue to disregard nature. How do you think we need to bring in the desired change immediately? So Jorge, if you could just answer these three questions, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief. Yes, I mean, regarding the first one, I think that the threats of biodiversity are clearly identified from many years, especially from the technical and scientific reports, IPES, the CBD, the Global Outlook, and others, including, of course, the deforestation, exotic species, I mean, the lack of an integrated system to manage and conserve biodiversity, and many other causes and reasons. So I think we have now a very clear data and information about what we have done bad in the past. What we really need now is basically to address this. And this is when I think the biodiversity law in general can really play a strong role. When I'm talking about biodiversity law, because the study is focused on comprehensive biodiversity laws, but we can include, of course, the role of forestry law, wildlife law, agricultural law, land use laws, planning use laws, and many others, of course, that can also play an integrated role jointly with the more comprehensive biodiversity laws. The second question, I think it's a huge challenge for everybody in the world, and has been clearly also identified by UNEP. Some of the UNEP reports on the status of the environmental law in 2018 is basically the implementation. I think we have now many, it's a big number of environmental law, is increasing exponentially at national level, at international level, but the key challenge is the implementation. It has been clearly set by this report by UNEP in 2018 about the ecological role of law, the status of the role of the law in the environmental field. There are many things, I think, coming from proper resources, capacity building, public participation, access to justice, strong mechanisms for the monitoring and review of the compliance with environmental laws, incentives for the private sector, including for indigenous and local communities, of course. So there are many. So I think the path and the way forward is more or less clear. We have enough evidence. We have enough data about the threats, about the potential responses. We have more or less some laws. Perhaps we need to expand this approach to other countries, but that's clear. And then we need to have some integrated system, I mean, joining with these laws, including other pieces of legislation, and work a lot in implementation, which I agree with you is key, but I don't think I have a proper answer for your question. It may take books, I think, to identify why environmental law is not fully implemented in many countries. I think that's it, Alexandra. Thank you for the comments.
Thank you, Jorge. And then let me turn to Patricia, because we also received some questions about the specific role of youth. They're important. So the question to you, Patricia, is how can the role and participation of young people be strengthened? And the second question to you is, what would you advise young people who want to be part of the movement to save nature?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with the second question. How can young people participate? And what I usually tell them, they do not have an excuse to preserve nature, because if they look around what they do, everything they depend on nature, and it will only take that one bold step from where they are. They can either choose to grow trees, they can either choose to do sustainable land practices. They could also choose to check their fashion traits and also how they consume and produce things. And again, what about nature and young people, what I would like to tell them, to be aggressive. And again, the issue to do with inclusivity, or rather inclusion in policy making, it's one thing that will make young people to have confidence in themselves and also spearhead the conservation of nature. So what we need to do, young people need to be included in policy making. They need to feel they are part of decision making and also problem solving. And again, what I would tell young people, to use social media as a tool for advocacy and also to learn on how they can be of good benefit to their societies, and also how they can tap the potential that is in land and actually getting land-based jobs for young people. There are so many land-based jobs that young people have not really tapped. So I would like to urge them and call them to tap that opportunity and not only view the white-collar jobs aspect only. There's so much in land and nature.
Thank you very much, Patricia. We've got some further questions. I would now actually like to come to the concluding round of all the three panelists. The minister unfortunately had to leave already, but if you, Julia, Jorge, and Patricia, if you could just make your concluding statement. So in about 2 minutes, if you could just highlight again in this super important year for biodiversity and for nature-based solutions, which policy interventions are needed and which solutions should we propose. And let me add one more question to Julia for concluding statement, which just came in from Hans-Peter Liniger. He asked, can we emphasize also the variety of ecosystems? So that also needs to be action on rangelands, wetlands, cultural landscapes, because he says there's a lot of focus on forests and he thinks that other ecosystems are also important. So could we just hear your concluding statements? And let me start with Julia, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think this question helps me with my concluding statement, because I think we've got a systemic problem, which will need a systemic solution. And one of that is that all of the major issues, whether it's inside the nature field or the biodiversity field, with all these different ecosystems being treated separately, but also in the link between biodiversity loss, between climate change, between our health issues, now we know this very well, between food security, are all treated separately. And, you know, different delegations that go to the different conferences, burning quite a lot of carbon, traveling to different parts of the world. And I was guilty of that too. I'm glad to be doing it less right now. Maybe this is another lesson. They don't talk to each other at home. And so we are looking at things too separately, including, again, all those natural ecosystems that was mentioned in the last question. And I think one of the systemic redesign that we are going to have to do, very elegantly saying that the system set up such a long time ago was very good, but now times have changed. And to try to put these issues together so we address them in a holistic manner. Just one other more specific recommendation, which has a lot to do with all of this, and I did want to ask myself whether Costa Rica was considering it, but the Dasgupta review of the economics of ecosystems, which is very much like the Stern review, ended up by actually making a revolutionary recommendation, and that is that the GDP system, which also worked well for a while, but it's also a little bit old, should actually be revised officially so that it includes the measure of a country's wealth nature is a part of the measure of a country's wealth. I don't know whether Costa Rica is doing it when it says that 23% of its GDP is represented by its natural wealth, but I don't think that's a part of the overall analysis, which is now the old GDP system. Again, that was good for a while. That's a very important recommendation, but it would change everything, and it would also change perhaps the way countries are ranked in the GDP. And some countries maybe don't want to admit that they're not as high as they look if they don't take care of their nature. So that's a very specific recommendation that I'm very much in favor of. And then let's try to at least talk to each other more so that these issues are connected.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your very wise recommendations. So let us hear from Jorge.
Yes, thank you very much. My final remarks. Well, I think from the legal perspective, because I'm a lawyer, I'm an environmental lawyer, we have many opportunities, I think, to increase. One is the quality of the laws that can be put in place in order to prevent future pandemics and also to conserve nature and to promote the sustainable use and the fair and equitable benefit sharing. And then we have a huge challenge in order to implement these laws in a coherent manner, in order to fully work, for the complete implementation, and that these laws can also can deliver the expected results. But we have a lot of opportunities. We have many good examples based on comparative law, of international law. What we need is basically to take the time to try to put in place all these mechanisms, to work with other pieces of legislation, and then finally to work very hard in the implementation of all this. If we are able to do so, I think at least we can contribute a lot in terms of the conservation, sustainable use, and benefit sharing, including, of course, from the perspective of human rights. That's my final remark.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and we very much look forward to your final handbook to be shared with everyone.
Very soon,
Patricia, please, from the youth perspective, your concluding words for the webinar.
Yes, I would say education plays a key role in conserving and protecting biodiversity, and we need to introduce education for sustainable development and equip youth with the necessary skills on which they can adapt and mitigate, and also tap the opportunities in land. And finally, what I would say is like a youth without environmental knowledge is like a bird without feathers. No matter what, they cannot survive. So we need environmental education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for highlighting again the importance of environmental education and the significant role of youth. As we all heard, we need a systemic approach, as Julia said. We need a health approach, we need an ecosystem approach, and we need to focus on solutions. We are all part of the solutions. Please remember that as we're celebrating the International Day on Biodiversity, and with this huge opportunity coming up this year for global biodiversity framework and for pushing our governments to have more effective nature-based solutions, I really want to thank all our esteemed panelists with a huge gratitude to you. So thank you so much for accepting to join the panel and to share your expertise. And we are very grateful. And I want to thank also our cherished participants and listeners who joined us here on Zoom and also on Facebook. So we thank you for your time and for listening. I hope we all have now learned more about the significant role of nature, the challenges, but also the solutions and the steps that we can take for a better future. We all have a duty to protect nature and engage for a global year for nature. So I also want to thank, of course, the entire team of the World Future Council, who have really worked hard to prepare the webinar. I want to thank Maurice Vaucure, Miriam Petersen, Anna Lara Steen, Samia Kassid, Gesa Dolkemeyer, and they helped to make this a success. Thank you all for your dedication. And we want to invite you already now for the next webinar, because this will be focusing actually on oceans. And we will be working again towards protecting 30% of oceans by 2030. If you're interested, please register. The webinar will be on the 3rd of June, again at 4 o'clock Central European time, again with a very interesting panel. And also we invite you to follow us on our social media with the World Future Council, where you also get more invitations about upcoming events. So follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. And thank you again for joining, and see you another time. Enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was very